Hey everybody, it's Steven here with Comic Vomit, and I'm taking the lead role because apparently Regan is going to be driving the bus today.
That's right. That's not nearly as charismatic as my openings, but
should we try it again?
No, keep going.
Oh, we're keeping it.
This is raw. Everything stays.
All right. Okay, that's it. I did it.
That was it?
That's it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Well, ask the wife. I'm short and sweet.
After weeks of sitting here like a moron listening to these guys talk about Mandalorians and Comic Cons and things I know nothing about, I'm very excited this week because now I'm in my domain. We are going to talk about pro wrestling. And I really don't think with this podcast we've talked, that we're trying to cover everything that's, retro pop culture. And I don't think you can have that conversation without discussing pro wrestling. So what we're doing today is we're actually going to rank not from best to worst, but we're going to go through every era in pro wrestling as far as the modern day version of it from about 85 up to present day. Kind of discuss the pros and cons of each, and then at the end, each person in this conversation is going to pick what they feel is the greatest era of the modern era. And with us today is John Hebert. John is an artist. Where are you based, John? You're in New York?
Yeah, I'm in DeFreestville, New York, just outside of Albany.
And you were Marvel, right? Marvel artist for a long time?
Yeah, I work for pretty much everybody but
Marvel, Punisher. If you get a chance, go to johnhebert.com and check out his Punisher work. It's fantastic if you're a fan of the Punisher. I know myself, I like it. It was in here for a while. Steven took it out of my studio.
Yeah, now it's in my bedroom.
Yeah. And
ain't none of that now.
Now you know why I'm short and sweet.
And also joining us today is pro wrestler, formerly known as Santino Marella, Mr. Anthony Carelli, who's going to be giving us his expertise from the inside looking out. So welcome to the Mark Show, Anthony, and thanks for tolerating us for the next 30 minutes or so.
No problem at all. Actually, I love this kind of stuff. I collected comics growing up, Marvel actually, and huge Star Wars fan. And I just watched like Mandalorian from the beginning to the recent episode, like in the last 2 weeks.
So you do what I'm supposed to be doing right now.
You're ahead of Regan. We had like.
Oh my God! We had Banks is the last one. Speaking.
I watched episode 1. I did actually.
You sat through one episode.
My daughter and I. Yeah. I haven't gone any further yet. I just haven't had time. I got to watch the Rocky IV director's cut for upcoming shows and.
Oh no! You got to watch TV. Yeah. Oh, that's such horrible homework.
All right, so without further ado, I think we'll just go through this chronologically. As far as the names of these eras, debatable what you want to call them, but this is what I've got. Starting out, I've put 1985 to 1993 as one era. Essentially, it started with rock and wrestling, and ultimately it's called the golden era of pro wrestling. To me, this is the era that would be the closest to comic book culture in terms of characters.
Yep.
The characters were larger than life. The villains looked like villains. There was no handsome villains back in that day, really. To me, it was from a wrestling standpoint, I guess it's debatable whether or not it's the best era in terms of work. But this is my era as a kid. Would you two shut up?
Hey! Speaking of wrestling.
There's 2 puppies in the studio here, guys. This was one of my favorite eras, but opinions, thoughts?
Jump in, guys.
Well, I enjoyed it too, but I mean, the main thing was I'd been a wrestling fan for a long time already at that point, and I'd seen some of the classic stuff, the 70s, WWF and NWA, because we had a really weird pirate station here in North Greenbush, New York, that had Southwest and Mid-South and Florida all in a 90-minute show. And it was hosted by Gordon Soley. And then when I had dinner with him, I said, hey, I used to see you on World League Wrestling. He's like, what's that? Found out later it was all pirated. And it was weird the way it was divided up. But I got to see the Harley race, Dusty Rhodes title change and all that stuff in 79. So, I mean, I had been reading the magazines, so I knew there were other territories besides WWF. But suddenly stuff was starting to come up on cable and you were seeing these other territories that you read about. And that era was interesting because, Vince was grabbing everybody up. All of a sudden, who was going to be on TV this Saturday? Who's he hired away now? Who's disappearing? Who's not going to be on that big show they're talking about at the Omni? And as far as the work rate, yeah, the work was still good in some places. WWF wasn't really pushing people to work their tails off at that point. But if you looked, you could find good, solid mat work and good, solid wrestling. I mean, the NWA shows certainly were loaded with, and they were still out there. Some of World Class was still going. World Class came here to Latham, New York, and we got to see them. The AWA, when they first came on cable, they still had some pretty good work. So it was there. It's just like anything. You have to hunt and find what you want.
Yeah, Vince kind of made the dream team, you know, and if every territory had 1 or 2 star players, he kind of recruited everybody and made this mega company. I would say the golden era has actually shifted a few years earlier. I think a little earlier in the 80s, and then it ended a little earlier, maybe even the late 90s, maybe even early 90s, you know. Yeah. But the biggest distinction between any of these eras isn't the content that was put out on TV. It was the wrestling world. And as soon as they came out and they said that it's entertainment, it's not real, that really trumps anything taking place in any era, because all of a sudden, so the work didn't have to be good when you believed this was a real competition.
Right.
Then it was about, you know, Popeye and Bluto, and can he reach the spinach? Can he reach the spinach? And it was a classic story that you could follow anytime. And these guys were so big and so strong. Like, do you think you can get out of a headlock from Big John Studd? It'll probably break your neck. You know what I mean? It could, because they were larger than life superhero characters, Andre the Giant, Hulk Hogan, and plus back then they used to fudge the numbers, and you know, 315 pounds.
If it's big, make it bigger.
Yeah.
Yeah, bigger. And then all of a sudden you look at your dad, like, my dad's 5'7". Holy man, that guy's humongous. You know, you start relating and stuff. And once they came out and said that it's entertainment, all of a sudden there's a dramatic shift in the content. I guess people thought that, oh man, they're not going to be into it anymore if they know it's not real. We got to get extreme. We got to get sexual. We got to get violent and blood and all that stuff. Little did they know that people were quite accepting of the entertainment side of it. And you know, for example, horror movies, that, you know, it's a movie, right? But when you watch a horror movie, you know, you're holding your blanket and you're getting scared, and you allow yourself to get into it. And that's what happened with pro wrestling. Everyone knows it's a work now, but you can go out there and still get behind someone who's not giving up, and he's the underdog, and he's kicking out, and he's making it to his feet. He's making it to his feet, you know, and kids can get behind it. So I think that kind of dictated a lot of what was happening. So, for example, golden era is the golden era. Mm-hmm. That's when Hulk Hogan, to me, was a real life superhero. Yeah. You know, Sergeant Slaughter was a G.I. Joe action figure. You know, they had cereal and cartoons and ice cream bars and all that stuff.
Yeah.
I think I think you can look at it. The turning point was WrestleMania. And I think if you want to bring it into the pop culture genre, it echoes a lot of what's happening these days with the MCU and the Marvel Cinematic Universe with Iron Man. So there's a lot of parallels between the first WrestleMania and Iron Man. And what the bottom line is that Vince took this big gamble. And what Anthony was saying is not only making it entertainment, but bringing in Hollywood celebrities, trying to crush the genre barrier. They had Liberace, they had Mr. T in the main event. So immediately you were grabbing all these other demographics, and all of a sudden, you know, the wrestling fan, you know, much like the comic book fan, was starting to get accepted and started broadening that scope.
Yeah.
Also, at that time, there may have been, like when I was a kid, I'm going to guess 13 channels on television.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, if you're one of 13, it's a lot more significant than being one of 1,000. And as far as, I know there were bigger wrestlers, but if you sat down at Christmas dinner and you had 25 people at the table, 25 people knew who Hulk Hogan was. Yeah. And could you say 25 would know who Seth Rollins is? You know,
and I was going to say,
he's very popular in the wrestling community, but he's not super mainstream.
Yeah, it's the same. It's the same thing today. Hulk Hogan was a piece of Americana. Yeah.
I think one of the interesting things, like what Anthony mentioned there, and it's going to be the difference between me and probably all three of you guys, when I'm going through this, like especially with these older eras, I can only relate to what I saw. And growing up on the East Coast of Canada, I had access to WWF, Pro Wrestling Plus, if you remember that, Anthony, or
yeah,
that was basically covered Stampede, I think. It was on TSN, and that was later on, and then Grand Prix Wrestling on ATV. So that was all I saw.
What was in BC? Wasn't there something in BC with Sergeant Al Tomko, remember?
But I see, I had 2 channels.
Okay.
I didn't anything on the West Coast. I didn't see.
Here.
I had the Atlantic Television Network, which had Grand Prix once a week, I think, for a while. WWE Saturday mornings, and then Pro Wrestling Plus came on a little later in the '80s, and I don't even know when that was on, but I'd pick it up once in a while, and that was basically covering the Stampede. And I don't know if it covered anything other than that, but the only reason I kind of gravitated to Stampede is because I recognized like Bret Hart's brother Owen and this kind of thing. So that's all I had. So when I've caught up with AWA and old NWA since then, but I have no nostalgia for that as a kid. So when I go
same here.
Yeah, and that's where, whereas John went right to that. So that was obviously the biggest influence on you whenever you were watching it as a younger guy.
Well, the thing was, we only had 3 channels here before we got cable, okay? And even when we first got cable, it only gave us, I think, an extra 3 channels. And then every year in January, we would get a couple channels and maybe we'd lose one.
Yeah.
And it was an exciting time. Again, I'd read the magazines because I'd gotten into it.
Yeah.
I'd gotten into wrestling, and the newsstand where I bought my comics at the time also had a huge rack of wrestling magazines. And my mother said one time, "Hey, they got wrestling magazines. You've been watching." That's I think it was Bruno on the cover. Yeah. So I bought one, and I was like, it was one of the after mags,
Yeah.
And so then I started picking them up too, and I was like, okay, so there are other companies besides the WWF. There are other territories.
There was a couple guys in my elementary school and high school that had magazines, and the magazines were incredible because you see this still picture, and it's usually at the end of a match when someone's bloody and sweaty, and you have to fill in the blanks with your imagination of what took place to get to there. Mm-hmm. Your imagination is often more grandiose than what actually happened. And when I got signed to my developmental contract, I was in Ohio Valley Wrestling in Louisville, Kentucky. Yeah. And Mike Bucci was just head of talent relations for a while. And he was finding that all these guys that, because there were shows like Tough Enough where you can be a regular person and say, you know what, I'm going to give it a shot. And you have this reality show, and the winner of the reality show gets a contract. So it was drawing from people that weren't wrestling fans. Yeah. So all of a sudden you had all these guys in developmental that didn't know anything about wrestling, like any territories. And I was a wrestling fan, but I was a wrestling fan of what we had, WWF. So all of a sudden he gave this project. I never heard of Gordon Soley before I got signed. I mean, this is like, I was signed by the WWE and I didn't know who he was. Now I know, all about him. And there was just so many different territories that I never heard of Smoky Mountain Wrestling before I got signed. I knew of the AWA because Hulk Hogan came from there, and I knew a little bit about Texas, But all these smaller companies and territories, I had no idea until I had this project that was given to us, and I learned a lot. And then just from conversations on the road, you get up to speed and catch up a little bit.
Well, I think
it would have been nice to watch them as they were happening.
I think that's the beauty part of the golden age of wrestling, was the fact that when it became mainstream and it opened itself to a wider audience, kayfabe was still in vogue. So a large component of the population thought what was happening was real. So it was up there with boxing and other competitive sports. So it just basically allowed people to dive into it. And then once they would digest that, I remember that I would get the Pro Wrestling magazine, and that's when you would start learning that there's other territories. It's not all just WWF. And that's when I started learning about Ric Flair and Pedro Morales and, all these other wrestlers and all these other...
As far as I'm concerned, those magazines catered to the other territories. Because I used to buy some of them as well, and it'd be like Ted DiBiase on the front, and I'm going to kill the Freebirds, and I'm like, who are these guys? Like, I had no idea what was going on because go ahead.
They did to an extent, but the aftermags wanted to sell magazines. People on the front more than not on the front covers. that were interesting and were visually interesting and would sell magazines. And since they were New York based, Northeast based, and WWF was here, they used a lot of the WWF guys, and they could. But they also were in love with Kerry Von Erich, were in love with the Road Warriors, were in love with Hulk Hogan and Dusty. I mean, Dusty wasn't the same as them, but he was flamboyant, and Flair. So a lot of those guys ended up on the covers.
Yeah.
And until Ted DiBiase, shortly before he became a $1 million man, he was a real bland-looking guy. He was a wonderful wrestler. But until he grew the hair out a little bit, permed it, and frosted it, and grew the beard, he was bland as hell looking. When he came through the WWF, or initially as the North American champ, people said Bob Backlund was a glass of milk. Ted DiBiase was a glass of plain milk.
Yeah, he was already second generation, right? Ted DiBiase.
Yeah.
Sometimes stepfather and his mother,
Mother too. Have you ever met him, by the way?
Yes. Yes.
Oh, I love him, man. You know, if we show up somewhere, let's say we're at Mania, and I get, he's sitting at a table, and we'll sit down and we'll just tune out everybody else and just talk. He's an awesome guy. His son too. I was on the road, Ted DiBiase Jr. with his son for a long time, and he's also an awesome guy.
We're getting ahead of ourselves, but I actually think his son, I thought he was going to be huge.
He was just over it, man.
We'll get to that, though.
He wants to golf and talk business deals on the golf course, and he skyrocketed to the top. He was the guy from that group, what were they called, Legacy.
Yeah.
That should have went on. And he's just, honestly, he's one of the first guys. I mean, you're making a lot of money, you're traveling the world, and he's like, I just want to go home and hunt deer and fish, and I don't blame him. I'm doing it now.
All right, so we'll get up to that era. We skipped about 3 all of a sudden, but
this is now part 1 of a 6-part series.
Oh, for sure. we cannot overlook the new generation from 1993 to 1997.
So I think the turning point of this would be the steroid scandal, correct?
Yeah.
The Arsenio Hall show.
Yeah, that basically gave Bret Hart his opportunity. When it was smaller guys for a while, and it's funny. So many people look at the new generation as probably the worst era in terms of business, characters, all the garbage men and plumbers and all that kind of stuff. But whenever I look at the old archived wrestling, like if I throw something on the network or something, for some reason I always go to like 94, 95. There's something about it that I just sit back. Maybe it's just the simplicity of it, but I do watch quite a bit of it. And aside from that, me personally, 1997, which does kind of fall in, is kind of the crossover year to the Attitude Era, but that was one of my favorite years in wrestling, 97. I think it was fantastic.
That was the big US versus Canada.
Yeah.
It was what, sorry?
That was the US versus Canada when Bret Hart reformed the Hart Foundation, and it was basically the 5 of them against everybody else.
That was great.
Like
Hart was a great worker, and
it was the first stepping stone to where they started playing with the gray area. They stopped having everybody being 100%. You're either 100% good or 100% bad, and you started having this gray area where, depending on where you were, if you were in Canada, the Harts were the good guys.
Yeah.
If you were in the States, they were the bad guys. And just the fervor and the patriotism, I think it's probably the only time, well, other than the Hogan versus Slaughter, I think it was probably the hottest time that patriotism actually came into wrestling.
Yeah, it's funny. Canada versus US. It's not even a real huge rivalry internationally. Man, there's not a lot of bad eras, but when they broke kayfabe, now we had to be a little more agile and a little more mobile. We had to up the wrestling a little bit, and just by the natural process of elimination, we started getting smaller guys. Yeah.
John?
At that point, it was a turning point. They'd had to come back from the steroid era, and they were in the midst of that, realizing that the characters were not enough anymore. People were tired of the garbage men and whatnot. They were starting to wise up, and they were starting to turn away from it. And they had to.
One of the down points of that era for me was when I look back on it, that to me seems to be the start of where they started trying to manufacture their champions. At least maybe I was old enough to see it, because, you know, Ric Flair came in, that made sense. You know, Bret Hart came in. I know internationally he was huge. He fit the bill as a smaller guy that could fly under the radar as far as the steroid scandal, and he was an awesome worker, so he got the spot. But then when it started with Diesel, that was meant to be, and no offense to the guy, he had a great career, but he was put in place, I think, to be the next Hulk Hogan, which that's a hard place to be in to begin with. And then after,
you can't create the next Hulk Hogan. It's got to happen by osmosis.
And
naturally.
then,
we saw the same thing in comics.
Right.
You can't create the next wave.
Right. And I think that's something that became more prevalent over the years, where then, you know, it flipped back to Bret Hart for a period, and then Shawn Michaels was going to be the guy. And as a wrestling heel, I liked Shawn Michaels, and as a worker, obviously, you know, he's incomparable. But when they started the thing with the manager coming out, and they started kind of really pushing him, I guess, that's when my love affair with him stopped, because now it doesn't seem like him anymore. Like when he became that dickhead in '97, that was great. Oh, the Degeneration X stuff was the initial formation of the Chyna and him, and that was fantastic, because that to me is like, that's who that dude is, in my opinion, at that time.
And then it got away from itself.
But the whole boyhood dream thing and that, like, they really started to manufacture champions at that time, and I don't know, maybe I was becoming a big mark at that point as a teenager, but I didn't like that. It just felt
I think
like
they started producing the show more too. I hear stories that in the golden era, they'd say, okay, here, Piper, you're going to go out there and cut a promo for 5 minutes, whatever. And Piper came up with the promo.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, you started getting writers and producers and directors, and a lot more production staff backstage, you know, trying to justify their jobs. So they're writing promos for guys. And I think that took the organic feeling out of it a little bit as well, and made it feel more produced.
Yeah, and you hear that even today, and that's, again, getting ahead of ourselves, but, you know, all the terminology that they seem to have, like a dictionary of terms they want to use, like it's, you know, championships, it's not belts, it's not straps, so I've heard. You know, in this very ring, like you hear them say that, you know, pointing at the WrestleMania sign. There's all these certain things you're supposed to do at certain times. If you win the Royal Rumble, you point at that sign, and the champion comes out and you stare down. And that's the stuff that I don't like, because it becomes very generic. And anyway, we're getting there. So has anybody not given their opinion on
of the small production? Was always a grab or two. It didn't matter which one. It always felt like this was happening now, even though it had been taped.
Yeah.
And you know, I think a big thing that was interesting was when they had the podium, and the two guys would be standing at the podium with the backdrop that said Southway or whatever, and guys would come out for interviews, and it was on the fly.
Yeah.
It wasn't scripted, although I know sometimes they did have to redo stuff, because there was a Bloopers and Practical Joke show years ago that showed a blooper from Georgia Wrestling, of all things, where I think it was by my friend Bill Eadie, the Masked Superstar, who went to pound on the podium. The podium gave way and Solely just stood there. I mean, there was an immediacy to that. And sometimes when things are produced too much, they just look fake.
Well, when you let people speak for themselves, there's a more organic process of the cream rising to the top. The audience is going to choose who they like, because they're seeing a character that the person's envisioning and the person's putting forward. You start writing characters for people and assigning characters. It's not coming from inside, and it's not going to seem as real. And that's also when they start thinking, okay, this guy's going to be the guy, instead of listening to the audience and saying, the audience likes this guy, let's go with it.
Yeah.
And don't forget, even though the new generation, we're hyper focusing on the WWF in terms of the steroid scandal occurring, switching to smaller guys. But the new generation, the third act had a great moment, and that was the turn of Hulk Hogan going heel and forming the NWO, with Hall and Nash going over to the WCW.
For sure.
And that kicked off probably the best time in terms of the competition, because up until that point, WWF was #1.
Yeah, the 96, 97, as I said, it does kind of fall into that new generation era, but that was the formation of the NWO. That was the formation of DX. That was the formation of Stone Cold Steve Austin.
Yeah.
That happened before the Attitude Era kicked in, so you can't negate that when you're talking about that era. The era started off a little drab, but they finished very high.
And if you think about it, during that whole lull, the catalyst for a lot of the seeds planted that would become the next coming of what would become the Attitude Era was caused by Bret Hart.
Yep.
Yeah.
And with that, the Attitude Era. I would say fall 97 would be the start of that to 2002. I would say if you asked probably 8 out of 10 people, they would say this is the best era. We'll all decide on that at the end of all this. But I mean, I've said already, 97, one of my favorite years. You know, if I were to pick a date that it kicked off, it was that Survivor Series in 97. Austin versus McMahon. You know, they morphed into a variety of characters. I loved, there was a kind of a youth movement there. One of the highlights for me, and it's something that I'm gonna probably piss on in some of the later years, is at that time, and I know a lot of people knock, you know, Vince Russo and things like that, but whoever was in charge of creative at that time, new guys didn't just show up on TV. They didn't just pop into the ring, and that there was vignettes leading in for weeks. So you think of Val Venus, you think of Edge, you think of these, you know, Kane, these guys that showed up. They really put a lot behind it and built a story up. So when they showed up on TV, it was a big deal. And I think for that time, that's why a lot of those characters did so well, in my opinion.
Jericho.
What's that?
Hit the ground running.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean that to me was one of the bigger differences than later years, where it seemed like even around your time, Anthony, you had a good debut. You came out of nowhere and they threw you right in, and that was great. And then you slowly evolved into that character. But there was a lot of guys that kind of just showed up and very generic names, and there just wasn't a lot. There was very vanilla in a lot of sense. Not to say they weren't good, you know, good workers.
Yeah, it happened on a large scale with 205. Right now, all of a sudden, they started this whole new division.
Yeah.
And there's like, here's all these guys you've never seen before. And some guys they have gotten behind, but it has taken time.
Yeah.
And some guys they just haven't, because there's been nothing to support the characters at all.
Yeah, exactly. For me, myself, like as far as any negativity with the Attitude Era, I would bring up, you know, from WWF standpoint, if you remove the Austin versus McMahon, how good was it? And the other thing is by 1999, I felt like it started to fall apart a little bit. It was still good, but then suddenly people are giving birth to hands. You know, people are in caskets having sex with corpses, and things like that started happening, where it's like, okay, they run out of ideas, but it was still a really exciting time in wrestling. But that's my 2 cents on that, good and bad.
Anthony?
Yeah, no, I agree. It's got a little. They were trying too hard. It seemed like, you know, and they were putting out so many ideas, and even when they talk about Vince Russo and some of his ideas, and he was really good at one point and really bad at another point, because he had that filter, that common sense filter, called, you know, Vince, that would kind of reel him in a little bit. Yeah, that period, I actually stepped away from wrestling a little bit at that part. You know, I just finished university and I was trying to get a whole life starting, and I didn't watch wrestling for years there. And I missed some of those years. But I've seen them back, you know.
But that's around
I didn't live it.
That's around the time you started, though, isn't it?
No, I started training in 2002.
2002.
Yeah.
Okay.
The end of the Attitude.
Oh no! Yes, I had a match in '99.
Yeah, because we were on the same show that day.
Yeah, but
I actually met him in '99 and didn't even know who he was, because that was the day Owen Hart died, right?
I had a match. I wasn't wrestling really. I started training in 2002 and had my first singles match in 2003. But in '99, the same day Owen Hart passed away, I think it was May. I did that one.
Cayuga Raceway.
Battle Royal that you were there.
They're having drag races between matches.
You know what's the interesting paradigm here? If you look at the Golden Age as opposed to the Attitude Era, the paradigm here is that in the Golden Age, everybody had a hero to rally around, and that was Hulk Hogan. Mm-hmm. And in the Attitude Era, because of the screw job, they had a villain to rally against, and that was McMahon. Mm-hmm. So really, if you look at it, when wrestling was at its zenith in both eras, they had a single person that they could rally for or against.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you mentioned it earlier, that area of gray when the bad guys started being cool and the good guys started being like, they started cheating a little bit.
Yeah.
And that was actually, I think, very detrimental to the wrestling business. I think they always should have kept very black and white, good guy, bad guy. It just makes this story so much easier to digest and follow, as opposed to, you know, you watch a match, some matches now, unfortunately, you don't know who to cheer for, and that should never be happening.
There needs to be heat.
I think though at the same time, like, to push back on that, a few people like that in amongst the mix is good. When you make everybody a shade of gray, I think that's where you get lost on it, because, you know, even thinking of a current show, like one of my favorite shows is Cobra Kai. And the way they've retold that story, and that here's what you didn't know what was going on behind the scenes, you know, and you, from week to week, you don't really know who the better man is in some cases. I love that. But I think if every character on that show was like that, then it gets to be a little bit much and it becomes kind of a gimmick. But when there's a few guys in there that you like them, but you just don't know what they're going to do next, that's fun to me.
And I think that's why Kurt Angle took off the way he did, because all the horses in the Attitude Era were going that way, which is very gray and tap dancing in the dark, where Kurt Angle said, you know what, I'm going back to the old, I'm going to be 100% goofy, and I'm going to play that up. And he shone. If you look at the skits that he did, like the milk skit, oh my God. Like and during the show, and I would see some live shows, when he was on, he was like counter-programming.
And I could be wrong about this, and Anthony, you might know something about this, but I feel like I heard somewhere that when he first debuted, he felt that the Olympic gimmick with the gold medal was going to be a babyface. And somebody told him that you're going to be hated, and he didn't believe it. I could be totally making this up, but I feel like I heard him say that in an interview at one point.
I think so. The interview with Stone Cold, maybe.
Yeah, like he thought that he was going to be...
Well, it's the same with Rocky Maivia. They pushed him as a babyface, and everybody rejected him for it.
Oh, yeah, that was...
The audience is finicky, you know? They're like a little stubborn dog. They don't like to be told what to eat.
Yeah.
Or a stubborn child, I guess, toddler. And it actually happened to me in the beginning when I debuted, and I'm like, I was in the audience, and I beat Chris Masters one week, and I sneak one over Shelton Benjamin, and I beat, you know, this guy, and people are like, come on, man, you can't just make us like this guy. He just showed up yesterday, and now a civilian can beat people, and they were starting to reject it, and then I turned heel.
Yeah.
And then it worked well. But to this day, I mean, look at Roman Reigns, John Cena. They do not want to be force-fed.
Yeah.
And I think that's the one thing I hated the most about the Attitude Era, is that's when the overproduction aspects of wrestling just took right over.
And again, we were talking earlier about manufacturing champions. That was a great point with Rocky Maivia. You know, again, they tried to do it with Diesel. They tried to do it with Michaels and those characters. It wasn't working. You know, Rocky Maivia wasn't working. The Ringmaster wasn't working. And then once they started evolving into these new characters they were kind of controlling it, those characters took off. That was organic. Yep. And again, that's why it worked. And so they got that boom for another couple of years. All right, so let's move it on to, this will be an interesting one, because Anthony, this is where you came out, the Ruthless Aggression era. Again, pros and cons of the era. One of the things I liked about it, ECW One Night Stand pay-per-views, that was really cool. ECW Reboot, not so much. I think the work rate for people that were a big fan of pro wrestling as an art form, it was a great era for work rate. The brand split, I think the first one happened then around 2002, 03. That, I think, kind of watered down the product a bit, but I guess it had to be done, and it did actually create some opportunities for the people. And I think one of the things that maybe hindered them a bit at that point is that's when the competition left, and then they were, you know, they didn't have that fire as much as they may have in past years.
It's always better when there's competition.
Yeah,
always.
That's my take on it.
They tried to artificially create competition.
Yeah,
WCW they buy.
Yeah, between brands.
Yeah, the WCW got bought for a song, and then they did that whole invasion angle, which I think they completely botched. And then they'd said, "Oh,
well,
this
even
is
SmackDown versus Raw."
yeah." Well, they had so many opportunities to do that invasion angle. It's like everybody dreamed about what WCW lifers would be like in the WW. I guess it would be WWE by this point. So it's like they had all these opportunities, and they just spit the bit, in my opinion. And then they watered it down by saying, "Oh, well, not only do we have WCW, we got ECW now, and we're going to bring that in." And they kept trying to go back to the well with hardcore wrestling. Like they took the old WWF championship and trashed it and made that the ECW, the hardcore championship. Everything just started, and then that's when they said, okay, well, they concluded that storyline and said, okay, we're going to do 2 shows. And in my thought, that was what they should have done is said, here's SmackDown roster, here's Raw roster, and they should have done a build-up where once a year they would have a World Series type event. Where
WrestleMania.
Exactly. You have 2 brands, they never meet, they're 2 isolated rosters, and have like the storylines culminate where you can do like the ultimate crossover, and then that's how your invasion.
But the thing is they say they do that now, and they don't. Every week somebody's crossing the border, and anyway, we'll get there.
We'll get there. Anyways, go ahead, Anthony. I think what are your thoughts on this era? You were in it.
I just agree that there's guys crossing the border every week, and the whole notion of and plus there was just a draft, and now the Survivor Series. So the whole the specialness of guys from other rosters meeting is really diminished because the guys are crisscrossing all the time.
It's turned into baseball.
Like this really was the era where I really slowed down watching. This became the era where it would be on in the background while I was doing something else, and if I heard something interesting, I would look. And something I've even told Anthony in the past, that one thing I can say is, before I ever met Anthony, and I've known Anthony for a few years now, when his character came on TV, especially that heel character, that would be one thing, one of very few things that would make me stop and watch, because I knew he was gonna do something stupid and ridiculous every week, but it was fun. Your character was unique. You stood out from a lot of vanilla at that time, and it was just a lot of fun, and I enjoyed it. And my wife can attest to this, that I used to always, when he was on, I would watch it, because it was things like the honkometer and stuff like that, and like that stuff was just so much fun, and it was kind of fun to laugh at a character, but the character kept winning, and like, I mean, a testament to you. I mean, you had a good long run there with that character, and for those who don't know, like Anthony's character before he came up, you were like a Russian sort of badass, weren't you? Like
special forces, Navy trained, military trained fighter guy.
And I mean, like, and this guy's got
vicious.
The judo background and all that. Like he could have came up and whooped some ass, but the fact that he came in and did this character was just, it was a breath of fresh air during a time that was very bland, in my opinion.
One thing I can say about my character is that the reason it had the longevity is because it was different. I wasn't a macho guy in tights, oiled up and saying I'm the greatest in the world. What I get a lot of is guys saying that I'm their wives' favorite, because a lot of guys that wrestle, the wives kind of got to watch it a bit. They don't necessarily like it, but they married a wrestler, they got to watch it. And I'm always the favorite of the wives or people's grandparents or anybody that watches wrestling, but is just begging for something different, and Santino catered to that something different. I was a Russian character on Friday. I got the call on Friday that I'm going to fly to Milan on Saturday, the next day. So I flew out Saturday, landed in Italy on Sunday, and I debuted on Monday as this Italian character. And I just switched characters in like one day. And all of a sudden I'm Santino. And then a few months in, we did the heel turn, and that was really when it took off. But I was like, I felt like I was betraying my Boris, my Russian character. Like what's going to happen to him? I can't just leave him here. And they're like, this is Vince's idea. This is, just shut up and go with it.
This is here, I got a question for you that I've never asked you, and I don't know if I've ever heard you answer, but it feels to me like because it was in Milan, Italy, and that like, did this all come together like on like a Saturday afternoon of a show that was Saturday night, and they just rushed you into that, and then out of that an eight-year character came out of it? But how much thought went into this character before you showed up on television?
No, I mean, they literally called me. I was driving to a live event in Elizabethtown, Kentucky as Boris. I was working as Boris. I was signed. I had my developmental contract. And they called me and they said, "Hey, Boris, can you speak Italian?" And I'm like, yeah, sure. And they said, "Okay, a couple things." And I was on speakerphone with some writers, and I said a couple things that I used to drive to downtown Toronto, and I was in rush hour for an hour every day, and I would play a tourist Italian tape. I just memorized enough of the tape to be able to say some stuff on the speaker, and everyone was like, "Yeah, sounds good. I don't know. It sounds pretty good." And that was it. It was enough to get me on that plane and fly over. And I had no idea what the character was going to be. I sat down with Vince on Monday before Raw, and he kind of had this idea to be this undersized, babyface, never give up fighter guy, and whatever you want, that's what I was going to do, you know?
Yeah, because it seemed like it started as kind of you were a character in a Bobby Lashley storyline to get over that feud. Like I wonder at that time how much actual long-term thoughts were going into your character. I mean, again, it turned out amazing for you. But at that time, it's like we need somebody who's Italian to get tossed on Umaga and get that win. And
well, yeah, Vince had this idea that I guess some numbers were down and the European numbers were down or something, and it was coincidence. Yeah. And lucky for me, Vince is like, "Do we have anybody that's Italian?" I haven't. Vince is very big on doing things that had never been done before.
Yeah.
And somebody coming out of the audience to an open challenge and winning has never been done before, and that was really, really important to
him. John, you have any thoughts on the Ruthless Aggression?
I was just interested as hell in hearing the way it was assembled. I love that, the way it was put together at the last minute. I think that's amazing. It's a testament to.
Oh yeah, it was very, very last minute. Unfortunately, guys, it's noon and I have to run. I have a meeting that's out of town.
So give us.
It was my pleasure.
Honor to meet
Anthony,
you.
Before you go, just give us your what do you think was the best? You can go from we'll go through the other ones ourselves, but Golden Age. Why?
Golden.
Give me a 30 elevator pitch as to why.
It's what captivated my heart as a child, and you can only be a child once. It was probably timing. If I was a child, maybe during the Attitude Era, maybe that would be the era.
Yeah.
But I was a child during the Golden Era, so that's the one that's forever in my heart.
Makes total sense. All right, buddy. Thanks so much for joining us. I know we went a little over, but enjoy your day and enjoy your weekend with your chainsaw or whatever you're going to do way up in the woods there.
Okay, thank you, guys.
Take care, pal. Talk to you soon.
Pleasure. My pleasure. All right.
All right, so we'll fire through. We've got basically
2 more eras.
Yeah, Anthony's out now, but I wanted to at least get Anthony up to the era he lived in. So we go into
PG.
Really?
Yeah, we just did Aggression.
No, because he was kind of the PG era. Anyway, we still got his stuff. The PG era, I'm going to the PG era and the reality era.
I don't even know where the turning points. Do you know where the turning points are? Like, it's interesting how, like, in each area, we can pinpoint, like, the Golden Age, WrestleMania. The next turning point was the steroid scandal, and then the Montreal screw job, and then what?
In my opinion, there was the Golden Age, the Attitude Era, and then there was just a bunch of stuff for 20 years. I'm not gonna lie to you. The Ruthless Aggression, they've done documentaries on it and referred to it as that, so I get that. I've heard them refer to the last decade as the reality era.
Like a reality show.
Yeah. To me, the PG era came after I think the PG era and the Ruthless Aggression era were the same era. because it was basically when they became a publicly traded company that they started pulling back on a lot of the craziness and the swearing and the sexuality, because they were a publicly traded company. They had to answer to a board of directors. And also, I mean, from the business side of things, they could get more advertisers.
Isn't that so anticlimactic, though? It's like when you look at every milestone that kicked off a new era, it had something to do with a storyline or the what was happening in the ring itself. To say that
issue that's really going on to plug that hole, that's happened a couple times.
Yeah. So to say that the modern era is because of business is so.
But as a business, how can you fault them? Because they've made more money in the last 20 years than they did during all that other time.
So they sold out?
What's that?
They sold out?
They bought in.
They bought in? Well, it's the same thing, isn't it?
You know, that.
All right, but listen, Arnold Schwarzenegger's made millions more than Laurence Olivier ever made. Who's the better actor? You know what I mean?
Yeah. So again, and I should have said too, like the new generation was an era, because that was how they promoted it around Bret Hart. So I kind of skipped over that one. So you've got your rock and wrestling golden age, new generation, attitude era, ruthless aggression, and then it just kind of, then they started really trying to find, what are we going to call this? And
but I almost think they're chasing their tail now. It's like everything is so.
Well, they're looking for the next thing that's going to happen. They're grasping at straws and throwing a lot of stuff at the wall, wondering what's going to stick.
I think
at some point something will, but
a great way to look at it though is when I was doing some quick notes today, just thinking back of these different eras. When I got, you can see my screen right now. When I got to 2008, and I've got the PG era, I've got nothing written down underneath that. That's because it was very forgettable. You know, I know that during that era, that was kind of when Edge became a big star, Randy Orton became a big star. They kind of had a second coming of Degeneration X with Shawn Michaels and Triple H. But really, other than that, there's not a lot that they did the Donald Trump thing, I think, during that time, which could have done without. And
well, basically, they were still feeding off of what they did with the Attitude Era.
Yeah,
but it was just they were starting to tame it.
But if I ask John, you know, what year did Hulk Hogan win his second World Heavyweight title, he can tell me. If I ask John, what year did Randy Orton win his 9th world title, he probably would look at me.
Right. It's not even an era to me. It's just there. It's almost like it's just what they're filling time with until the next event happens.
Yeah.
Well, the belts have no value anymore.
They've at least smartened up to the point where they realize that at some point, I think they know that at some point they're gonna have something that's gonna smash everybody in the face, and then they're gonna jump on that train and ride it.
Yeah.
They're at least smart enough to know they can't create it, they can't micromanage it. They try a little, but they're not trying as hard as they used to, because that just, I mean, okay, look at WCW when they were trying to compete with WWF and Herd took over, and he was trying to make everybody a character and make it all PC, and it was awful. It was so strange. And let me use a term that I've used way too much with comics and whatnot, but it's the Monkees and the Beatles. The Beatles were the biggest band in the world, and they wanted to create a TV version of them. They wanted to create the Monkees, which they did, okay? Now, the Monkees were a fun bunch. They had some pop songs that were fun. The TV show was good, and they made a chunk of change, but they were never going to be the Beatles.
Yeah.
The Beatles were the Beatles.
Yeah.
And I've said this in comics, you know, when the Image era was ending in comics, very much like DX or whatever, Marvel was trying to create the next thing. Hey, people kind of like the anime look. Let's go with that. It made a chunk of change, but it was never that, unfortunately, McFarlane or Jim Lee or whatever.
Yeah.
They were a success. It was never as big as that because they thought it was going to be. So, okay, here's this over here now. We'll go with this and we'll manufacture this. Didn't work.
Yeah.
You know what's really funny though is the more we talk about it, we're walking through all these eras and everything. I keep having parallels pop in my head in terms of what wrestling has gone through its peaks and valleys and its different generations, and what comic books has done. Like if you just said Image, if you think what is the wrestling version of Image? NWO. Seriously, a bunch of guys, all the hot shots from New York, went on their own to California.
Yeah.
And they basically just.
But see, like everything else, though, like when you have a home run like that, you have to learn to build off of it. And what these guys did was they tried to milk it dry. And the NWO came out, it was cool. But then all of a sudden, there was 27 people in it, and half them just should not have been there. And then then it's the 2.0 version. Then they split them up, and it's like now we're jumping the shark 10 times over, and it wasn't cool anymore.
Well, that's because Bischoff didn't. Bischoff basically had a happy accident, and he didn't know how to maximize.
And I think that's a recurrent theme in wrestling is usually when something great happens, it happens organically. They fall into it, but then once they get behind it, they try to exploit it to the point where it's just it just jumps the shark, and then they're still trying to do it, and then they rehash it, and it doesn't work after a while. And that would be the same for comic book characters. You have to evolve, and you have to create new stories, new characters, and that, or like you can't just keep telling the same story.
Well, and I think that was the great part. We're going to circle back. I think we're validating why the golden era is the best era, is because in that era, they allowed a lot more happy accidents, a lot more improv. There was a lot more organic happenings. It's like I every now and again, I'll scroll through Facebook and they'll have like an old Saturday night's main event. And I can't take my eyes off of it because there's so many parallel stories that are happening. And it doesn't have any feel of overproduction. So in terms of looking forward, the product today, now because of COVID, they've had to evolve into a very much a, like a Max Headroom style.
Yeah, so let's, to kind of tie this together before we kind of give our answers, let's be fair to the last 10 years. A lot of good things have happened in the last decade. The creation of their development system, they seem to have opened the doors again for not creating wrestlers, but for bringing in these guys from the independents. So now, over the last decade, you started seeing not everybody looked like Randy Orton. You're seeing short guys, overweight guys. It's starting to become a collection of characters again, which is very good. UK territory. So there's been a lot of positive things that have happened. In terms of the current television product, I don't watch it anymore. And the last few years, it's been to the point where I get angry because I just can't watch it. And if I do try and turn it on, I don't enjoy it. Now, with that being said, recently, one of the things I do like is they do kind of an ESPN big sport feel. Now they are trying to kind of have that ESPN vibe. The network documentaries are phenomenal. Whoever's doing their YouTube and their documentary series and that are fantastic storytellers, and seeing a lot of that is good. The last few years, they've been the last 8 years, I guess, they've been trying to make Roman Reigns the next John Cena. I've never been a huge John Cena fan, but to that man's credit, he was the flag bearer for that company for longer than any of the guys we've talked about already. So he deserves a lot of credit for that. He's a workhorse. They tried to get Roman Reigns to be that guy. I don't felt that ever worked until the last couple of months, what they're doing with him. Now that he's doing this sort of tribal chief bad guy thing, that I like. The Drew McIntyre character on Monday Night Raw, the guy looks like a warrior. I just happened to see last week, he came out wearing a kilt like he used to do way back when he first debuted, and he came out with this giant broadsword that apparently belongs to Vince McMahon that Triple H and Stephanie gave to him. Vince brought it and gave it to him to use at the show. And so now he came out on stage, and the guy looks phenomenal, and he planted the sword into the stage. Fireworks went off. I'm like, okay, this is cool. He looks like a character. He looks like something from the 80s you would see come out. And now, and Triple H mentioned in a recent interview that he sees the current Roman Reigns character and the current Drew McIntyre character as a collision that could be on the level of like a Steve Austin Rock, these two guys. Now, again, I don't believe that's going to be the case. However, they're two very strong looking characters that I have not seen in a long time in their current incarnations of these characters. So that would be my take on that. There have been some other things too that are good, but those are my highs.
My highs the past few years were New Japan getting cable. Of course, now they've lost it, but they're trying for a new TV deal. Watching them was like what I thought wrestling should have gone to. They're still fun. There was still a little gaga, as Cornette would put it, but it was mostly like a sporting event. It felt real. And I was blown away by that. I was looking forward to that every Friday night. I'm also liking what Ring of Honor is doing with this, the Pure title again. Mm-hmm. I've actually started watching that again the past few weeks because I heard people raving about it. It's good, but it's a little dry. I think one thing that could have helped that would have been if it wasn't the COVID era and they had people in the arena. I think that was the one thing that was missing. I think that was the straw that would have stirred the drink. I'm loving that. I still haven't watched WWE in a long time, admittedly. I'm sorry. I watch All Elite until they do something so stupid that I just have to change the channel, like the musical number a few weeks ago. There's good stuff there too. You just gotta separate out the chaff and get to the wheat.
I just feel that there needs to be new blood, not from a wrestler, like the wrestlers themselves, but I mean from the promoters. We need someone who has a unique vision like Vince McMahon had in the early 80s, where he had a vision where he was going to buy up all the territories and take wrestling mainstream. We need someone with the same vision that can come in and just kind of rattle it up a bit.
I don't think they'll be that guy. They'll never be that guy.
No?
Vince McMahon is such a unique character.
Not overnight, no.
It's just not going to be. And the other thing too is when Vince McMahon started doing this, your ways of entertaining yourself were so much more limited. And so like two things I won't, even though I don't watch the product as much anymore, like two things I'll say with WWE, I don't judge anything on 2020 because what the hell are they going to do? I mean, all things considered, I think they're doing the best they can. So I won't judge because without the crowd, I couldn't imagine
I appreciate
wrestling.
that. I think there's an opportunity there though.
Yeah, well, I mean, we'll see as we go. They talk all the time about the ratings going down, and I do think a lot of it has to do with the product not being as good. But the fact of the matter is, they did let the cat out of the bag. People know it's fake. The writing has not been as strong, but there's so many more things. Like there's YouTube, there's all these streaming services, there's internet, cell phone. Like there's so much stuff to consume your time with. People aren't turning on the television and turning to channel 30, whatever, and sitting down and watch wrestling for 2-3 hours. It's just a different world now than it was 20, 25 years ago.
Agreed, but I think what the WWE had in the 80s has now been shifted over to UFC. UFC is real. And I think the people who watch that are the people who were so involved in wrestling in the 80s, and now they're getting the kids because they know that's real. Now, if you could somehow flip wrestling on its ear, and I've even heard, I don't know if you've heard Jim Cornette's podcast, but they're amazing. Yeah. And he has some really great ideas on how you could flip wrestling on its ear and basically take kayfabe as it is now and how everybody knows that wrestling is, conspired, and basically bring that reality into the story. Like the one where he said his vision of what he would have done when WWF at the time bought the WCW is he would have had the wrestlers come in and say, look, you could tell us to lie down, but we're going to hurt your wrestlers. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like doing an angle like that, which basically blurs again reality and fantasy.
But there's an evolution to wrestling styles and that as well. Like when I trained, like that I've trained in wrestling in the past, and I was a wrestler for a few years. When I was trained, the guy who taught me to basically treat a wrestling match like a fight. If you do a move to knock a guy down, you don't pick him back up again. You get down, you do a hold on the floor, and you treat it like it's a real fight with that element of drama and theatrics to it. Now it's become more like a dance, where it's like, and again, it's nothing against the athleticism of some of these guys, but the art of storytelling is lost in the modern era, with the exception of a few throwback characters that still know how to do it. Yep. And that's a huge problem. So when I see a guy like Edge come back this year, that excited me, because that's a guy that right before he signed his contract, he actually did his training at the school I was at. He came down and would beat us up for a few hours a day, getting ready to go up to start doing this Edge character. But he knows how to wrestle. He knows how to tell a story. And so like those guys coming back are always a breath of fresh air, because they're just from a different era where they were taught a different way. And now it's become more of a lot of the flips and stuff. But again, with that being said,
everything's a finishing move.
The UK influence and the Japanese influence is starting to come over stronger, and that's helped a lot as well.
So let's wrap it up, and let's pick our favorite. John.
Favorite era, John.
Favorite era.
The golden age and golden age A, even before what we discussed. Yeah, I mean, I still love that. I loved wondering who was going to turn up on WWF TV every Saturday. And I loved it before then. I loved it when there were basically 3 big companies and a bunch of little ones. But I love it all.
Well, for me, as much as I love the golden age, I was never more engaged than when they had the entire the U.S.-Canada angle. For me, that was when every week I had to see, and I hated the U.S. I love the U.S. Don't get me wrong. I got lots of friends down there, but when I was watching it, I was like, yeah, those Americans, they have bad manners, eh?
Well, you go back and watch Bret Hart's documentary, and they interview Canadians outside of like the Stampede show in '97. And it's funny because, like, I hear they started it, and then, like, it's like Canadians that are mad at the U.S. and there was so much drama between it. And
I loved it.
And I attended the Survivor Series in '97 at the pinnacle end of that, and it was off the charts. And when they screwed him over, I was there afterwards because I had to wait to get my chair.
Yeah.
And some guy came out representing the company, asking everybody enjoyed the show, and all these guys were going nuts. I still didn't even know what happened. I thought I was a pretty smart fan, but I was really confused about it. I knew something was wrong, but these guys were just like, they were so pissed off that they screwed over Bret Hart.
It was a fantastic storyline that didn't have an ending. So the ending was a bad ending.
So that technically is the new generation.
Oh, that's me.
Yeah. I'm literally making this decision right now. I didn't make it going in. I was teetering between golden era and new generation, and I'm actually going to go with new generation, which is very much not normal, but I think it was a very weak start and a very strong ending. And I think that 96, 97 era was probably one of the strongest couple of years in pro wrestling. You had WCW become a player with the NWO. You had this is where Austin became a thing. This is where The Rock debuted. He wasn't really The Rock yet. He was getting there, but this is where that character came out, who was going to be a huge character. It was the catalyst that created the boom. Yep. So instead of going with most people and going with that boom period, I'm going with the where that boom period kind of was sprouted.
Okay.
So that's where I'm at with it. Probably not what a lot of people would pick, but so we got two golden age, 2 new generation. What do you guys think? Love to hear your comments below. Let us know. No swear words. And that's basically it. This is the longest podcast we've ever done, but I actually personally enjoyed it. John, we got to get you on for more wrestling podcasts, John. You know your stuff.
Well, it's something I enjoy. I hope I'd be glad to do one again.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll see how many people watch this one. If it's good, we may have to have you on every week.
All right, John. Thanks for your time, man. We'll talk to you soon.
Take care.
All right. Talk to you soon. Take care, guys.
So that's it for this week of Comic Wrestling Vomit. And let us know what you guys thought. Big thanks to Anthony Carelli and John Hebert for joining us. I really enjoyed this. It was good.
I'm glad you could enjoy one of these.
Going in. No, I enjoy them all. But going into this, like, again, it's like, how do we make pro wrestling a part of this comic book culture? But I do think with movies and with television and things we're getting into, we are becoming more pop culture and less completely focused on comics. And to me, they're 2 parallels. It's the same universe, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I think my level of enjoyment of pro wrestling is similar to what yours is for the comic book world.
I love wrestling. Up to a point, but like I said, as we were having this conversation, there were so many parallels that I could see between the comic book industry and the wrestling industry, and of course they have synergies. It's like. Yep.
Yeah, and those guys are all at the Comic Cons now.
They are.
WWE has a huge presence there now, my understanding. So.
I think last year, Jake the Snake and I, crossed paths in the bathroom at least 5 or 6 times. Wow. No, not literally, figuratively.
Hey, let's not go there.
Are you one of those guys that talks to him at the urinal when he's taking a piss?
Oh, hell no. No, actually, he talked to me. He talked to me in Hamilton. I'm sitting there at the stall. I'm sitting there at the stall, and he's coming, "Hey, brother, have you had your coffee yet? Because I certainly could use one." And I'm like,
coffee.
That's it, guys. Thanks so much for tuning in. Let us know your thoughts on these long-form podcasts, because I know they are long. But enjoyed this one. We will talk to you guys next week. Take care.
Are we going to do a Batman?
Sure.